But thanks for joining us today. Again, this is the DNP Users Group Industry Workshop on Understanding Integrity for OT Systems, Achieving Usable Security. We're excited to have a great panel lined up for you today with a little bit of a different format that we're going to follow. And so we hope that works out well. We're going to do a little bit of shorter intro presentations and leave a little bit more time for some open dialogue and then plenty of time for Q&A from the audience at the end. So looking forward to an engaging panel with everybody today. I do want to cover just a few housekeeping things before we get started. You do have the ability to unmute and to start video, and we're leaving that open so that when we do get to the Q&A, you're welcome to unmute yourself and start your video so that we can see who you are and you can interact with the speakers during that time. But we do ask that you just try to minimize background noise, keep yourself on mute, and preferably keep your cameras off as well, unless you are actively engaged in the Q&A. We are recording the workshop and we intend to make a video available after the session on our website. So if you have an issue with that, feel free to drop off. You can catch the recording later, or maybe just stay muted and you can not have to participate live in the Q&A if you don't want to be recorded. We will be using the AI companion to capture notes there as well. Like I mentioned before, we will have questions and discussion time later. Feel free to enter any questions along the way that you might have in the chat. We've got some people lined up that are going to be watching the chat to be able to answer any questions that maybe don't have to be answered directly by the panelists, but certainly we'll have the panelists watching the chat as well to try to answer anything that comes up there. And we will ask you to hold any questions until we do get to that open Q&A section, but feel free to throw them in the chat if you really have something that you want to get out right away. And then finally, we will have a survey after the fact, and we always are looking for feedback to come into our membership coordinator at that membership@dnp.org address. Feel free to send any comments or suggestions for future sessions there, and if you have any comments about today's session. I've got two other things to cover here real quick before we turn things over to John, our panel moderator. I want to make sure everybody knows that we have a utility council that's going to be launching. Our first meeting is going to be May 21st from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern. This is a pretty exciting new initiative that the users group has started up. We've really focused on trying to get an opportunity for utility users of DNP3 to come together and talk about what is important to the utilities, what improvements do they maybe want to see to the protocol, what work products, what services, what things are important to them, and not just to the vendor community and other adopters and integrators, but really just focused on those utilities. So if you have an interest in that and you did not receive an invite, this went out to our utility members of the DNP users group. If you do have questions or you're interested and you did not get that invite, again, reach out to that membership@dnp.org address, and Sarah can get you connected with the information that you may need. And then finally, coming soon, sometime in the summer of 2026, we haven't quite settled on the dates yet, but probably sometime in June or July, is going to be coming part 2 of our training series, Managing Distributed Energy Resources using the IEEE Standard 1815.2 DNP Profile. This was a great session put on by Grant and Francis, again, moderated with the assistance of John McDonald, who's with us again today. The part 1 of this training was intended to be member only, but we had such a great response. We ended up opening it up to industry and really had a great turnout. But part 2 is going to be members only. So you've still got some time if you're interested in that. You've got some time to sign up and get your membership squared away so that you can attend part 2 of that training. That's going to be really great. So I got so far ahead of myself, I didn't even introduce myself. My name is James Formea. I'm with Eaton, and I am the Vice President for Education and Standards on the DNP User Group Board of Directors. I'm excited to be able to bring the session to you today and getting ready to turn the things over to John McDonald with JDM Associates, who is a longtime friend of the users group and expert moderator that's been doing just a ton of work for us in putting these sessions together and helping us step through these exciting topics. Couple of disclaimers in case anything comes up in discussion here. If we're talking about specific standards, both the ones that DNP3 is related to as well as some others, just recognize that we don't intend to be authoritative source on anything other than DNP3. So IEEE, IEEE SA, IEC, the other affiliated committees, working group, user groups, they all hold the authority over those products, and we're not claiming any specific rights to them. And also, we're not going to cover those standards in comprehensive detail. So just be aware that we may touch on one topic and maybe not touch on all topics that are relevant from those standards. So with that, we've got our agenda for today. We're going to start with some brief introductions. And like I said, we're going to turn it over to John McDonald with JDM Associates. And then we've got Matthew Rogers, Ginger Wright, and Demos Andreou with us. And I'm going to let John give you those introductions here. So John, the show is yours. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, James. It's hard to believe this is our fourth workshop. It doesn't seem like it's been that long ago that we had the very first one. They've been well accepted, and attendance continues to grow. And the one advantage of the workshops is that they truly are open to the public. So you can really learn a lot in the next 90 minutes. We always have a group of very experienced industry speakers like we do today. And James mentioned a little bit different format. You know, when we're at industry meetings or virtual sessions like this, the feedback we get a lot of times is that attendees learn more from the interactive discussions than they do the presentations by the panelists. So we've shortened the presentation time and lengthened the amount of time for the dialogue, both dialogue with myself and the panelists, as well as interactive discussion with all of you. And as James said, either unmuting and asking a question or using the chat feature. We'll have about 5 minutes of introductory presentation material by each of the three panelists. We'll have about 35 minutes of dialogue with myself and each of the three panelists. And what's important there is we'll get perspectives of more than one panelist many times on questions, which gives us a lot more insight into the background on those topics. And then lastly, we'll have about 25, 30 minutes of time for questions from you. And I really emphasize, take advantage of the opportunity to ask our three experts questions, as well as Grant and Andrew, who will be monitoring the chat and answering any of your questions in real time. So as James said, you can see on the slide here, we have Matt Rogers, and we have Ginny Wright, and Demos Andrew as our panelists. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with our introductory material, 5 minutes, about 5 minutes from each. And we'll start with Matt Rogers. Matt will kick it off, and then we'll have Demos talk, and then Ginger, and then we'll open up then to a dialogue between myself and the panelists. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and give your material.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. So just to kick things off, hi, I'm Matt Rogers. I'm a OT security lead here at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So a couple months ago, we released a paper called Barriers to Secure OT Communication, Why Johnny Can't Authenticate. If you think that name is funny and is a little funky, it's because it is. It's based off a 1999 paper, shows you how relevant we are. That 1999 paper was basically talking about people who tried to secure their emails back in 1999. And the gist was, it doesn't matter how good the technology is if people aren't really capable of using it. In this case, talking about PGP. And we wanted to extend that sort of analogy to operational technology and securing our energy and our water systems, because the technology to secure OT communication has existed for well over a decade at this point, but we've always had a bit of an adoption issue. So across our legacy install base, across stuff being installed today in the year 2026, we still see not as many people implementing these secure communication systems. Certainly more than it was a decade ago, but it's still nowhere near ubiquitous. And so we wanted to give an understanding of why that is and what is the gap between the technology and implementation. So to get to that point, we interviewed operators across energy, chemical, water, transportation, food and ag sectors about what they've tried, what's worked, and what hasn't. So, you can see more stories throughout the paper from all of our interviews, but to get to the slide in front of you, right, I'll just talk through some interesting tidbits across motivation, what drew people towards the idea of secure comms, where is it useful? Design, so procurement, like what issues do they run into during procurement, and then deployment and operations. So the first thing would be, why does anybody even want secure communications? And the main use case was signing, the ability to make sure that if A is talking to B, I know A is really A, and I know that the message has not been changed as it goes from A to B. If you take away nothing else from the talk, one of the main pieces of confusion that we ran into across many, many very smart operators is disentangling this idea of encryption and signing. Encryption is protecting the confidentiality of the message. And like every modern web application, it is also signing the message. But signing is built off the same technology, but it's a different process. It guarantees the integrity of the message and says that, it authenticates the message. So it says, I am really who I am, and that this message has not been changed in transit. And that is really what matters more from an OT perspective. We often see encryption as sort of the scary thing and the reason why people don't adopt secure communications. But I just want to be clear that this is different. It's a lot safer. This doesn't in any way hide a lot of the engineering traffic and data. There is a place for encryption in OT networks, but signing is the really main focus, right? Signing protects, encryption hides. Sometimes you need to hide something, but it's harder to break things if you're just signing. So that was the main thing. We saw operators across the gambit wanted those integrity protections more than just a parity bit in the modern day, something to actually protect against a malicious user. In procurement, we run into some interesting things from the initial hurdles of trying to get the technology, from OEMs charging additional licensing fees to enable the secure version, to upgrade costs being absurd for upgrading to communications cards that supported the updated secure communications protocol. So when I say at the bottom of the slide, recommendations for manufacturers, if you're an operator, take that as recommendations to what to look for you. Things that as we move forward can make it easier and easier for you to adopt secure communications so that the burden on you as the operator is less and less. One of the more interesting insights we saw was, people in response to these costs to just wrap things in TLS, which also worked, just to take the vendor out of the equation. One of the more interesting insights we saw is that a lot of operators were scared of buying at the wrong time. They thought I'd buy this protocol and then, well, there'd be a new version the next year, or in 3 years, you'd be talking about something new and you'd be, in that legacy environment again. And the real thing to get you out of the situation is focus on things like crypto agility, where the protocol can be updated over time, can be changed. It's not just a static thing you buy once and can never change again. And then focus on, what is the upgrade path, what is secure by default, so that you don't have to focus as much on that upgrade in the future, or at least you have a clear idea that this won't go out of business. Additionally, focus on things like open standards. If you follow an open standards and it's widely adopted across industry, you're probably not going to have to then rip that out in the future. We ran into one water utility who bought a proprietary secure communications platform. That company went out of business and they had to rip out all of that from their infrastructure, which was very painful. So look for those clear upgrade paths. Finally, and through deployment, look for what's easy to deploy. One of the main insights from operators is that many of them felt they needed a third-party integrator just to even adopt this technology. That isn't necessarily going to be true all the time. It depends on your install base. Of course, people need outside assistance, and that's normal. But look for what's easy to deploy. Look what's for secure by default. Look for something that doesn't just require you to establish a laborious PKI infrastructure, that doesn't expire certs in 30 days. That's something that's really adapted for the OT environment. And then finally, in operations, look for simplified key management, really take it step by step. I want to encourage people, you don't really have to eat the whole elephant at once. You can start by just adding signing capabilities to your devices and not dropping any traffic. Log what would be dropped if you had full enforcement in place. And then as you feel more confident, you can kind of ramp that up over time, from signing communication and dropping messages, starting with self-sign, never expiring certs if you really need to. It's not a best practice, but it's not about what the best practice is. It's about what can actually get you signed communication in OT environment, and you can change and improve that over time. And eventually that might end up in encryption, or it might not, depending on the environment. Where we'd really prioritize things like that are northbound traffic, things if it's leading the field site, if it's leading the substation. That's where we'd really encourage you to factor things like encryption into play. But actually within that field logic, just focus on signing and focusing on the integrity of the communication. And with that, I will pass it over to Demos to talk about all the fun of legacy devices and how do we adapt all of these fun recommendations for the fact that, well, I've got a bunch of stuff already. What do you want me to do with that? So Demos, take it away.
Okay, my name is Andreou, and I'm with Patterson Dewar Engineers. I have I have been doing OT security and OT field work for many, many years, so I have a lot of experience in that. So I will share today what I have observed over the years, and I will start by highlighting the existing landscape. So what I have seen over the years is that utility rely on outdated vulnerable devices because they meet the protection requirements. In many occasions, when I ask, why don't you use security in your devices? The answer is, well, protection, these devices were designed to provide protection, and protection is a requirement. Secure communications were not. Furthermore, a lot of these devices, they were designed in an era where the idea of an adversary trying to penetrate persistently into your network and extract information from your devices was not even a thought. So a lot of these devices, they use security as an afterthought. New devices today, they support some security features, like signed firmware, for example, and other features. However, they implement not to implement secure versions of protocols. Like, for example, SAV5 has been around since 2016, 2017, like for 10 years now, and there's only a handful of people that they're using it. So people are trying to use compensating controls to compensate for the lack of security. However, in my experience, those controls are not implemented correctly, even when they are implemented. So the best way to tackle this problem is to better understand the risk of the organization. In order to do that, we need to do a risk assessment and determine which of all of these security features that they are available is the right fit for them for each utility. So some of the challenges that were experienced in doing this is the human factor. The human error is always, I mean, the human is always going to be the weak link of security. It is relatively easy to manipulate and influence human behavior. By and large, we as humans want to help. So people use this attack vector, if you will, to attack the human. The other major challenge is legacy systems. Some of these systems, they were designed and they have been in operation for 30 years. They're not easily upgradable. And for as long as they provide the original functionality, people don't want to change it. I mean, just because vendor A added this new security feature to my device, but in order to upgrade my device, I need to buy a new device. In some cases, I have to buy a new card for my device, which tends to be very expensive. So in that respect, legacy systems, they're not easily upgradable. Also, physical security is a big issue. A lot of these OT assets are located in isolated locations, and they are, for the most part, easily accessible. I can log into a cabinet on the control on the side of the road, and if I have a hard hat and an orange jacket or a yellow jacket, nobody is gonna question what I am doing there. And it will give me easy access to the device. And because uh, because of the lack of security features in these devices, it will be easy for me to log in and change communication settings, or even worse, change the protection settings in the device. Now, replacing these devices can get to be very expensive, and people don't see the value. I mean, cybersecurity is often doesn't have a tangible return on investment. So you're going to get all these additional security features for this dollar amount, but how does that help me? I mean, what does that do for the organization? So the purchasing agents, they don't always see the return on the investment. Furthermore, some of these new features require additional training, and although some of them can be relatively easy to implement, others may require training from the vendor, cybersecurity training, which is very different than the IT training that they receive from the organization. So this is like another obstacle that there is in implementing secure communication and adding secure features to the devices in the field. Okay, Ginger, you're next.
Thank you, Demos. So my name is Ginger Wright, and I'm coming to you from the Idaho National Laboratory. My research focus and my usable security focus is in cyber-informed engineering. And we want to specifically focus on engineering controls for usable security. So if this is the first time you're hearing about cyber-informed engineering, this is a really different take on cybersecurity. With cyber-informed engineering, we're looking to the engineer who normally would help to ensure that the process is controlled effectively and worries about safety and other factors, and leveraging the same controls that that engineer might use to control the process to actually eliminate what an adversary could do if they had unconstrained access to the digital technology. This doesn't keep us from taking advantage of Demos's advice, or, as Matt has suggested, using secure communication. Instead, this augments those practices. Anything that I don't want an adversary to be able to do, if it's possible for me to engineer that process or that possibility out, then I can prioritize using that control and spend less energy on the digital protections that come in place. With cyber-informed engineering, we reach to the engineers and technicians to get their insights on how we perform cybersecurity. So looking at the functions within the process that are most important to function all the time, every time, and then building controls that limit what this very feature-rich, as both Matt and Demos have suggested, technology can put into place so that the technology can only do the things that we would want it to do anyway. If we can go to the next slide. In our traditional cybersecurity thinking, we often protect against access to or sabotage of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. We're thinking about having an adversary or a hacker get access or manipulate data. And when we think about infrastructure security, the things that we think are important are safety, reliability, and performance. Of course, we want to protect the data around our process and ensure that we keep it secret, that it is what it is supposed to be, and that it's available at the right times. But more importantly than that, we want to ensure that an adversary can't use access to that data to cause a safety issue, to cause a reliability issue in how we perform, or stop performance altogether. We've all certainly heard about attacks like the Rolls-Royce one recently, where that particular manufacturer was out of service for months at a time and could no longer perform. So the idea behind cyber-informed engineering is using first that engineering sensibility about the functions that affect safety, reliability, and performance the most, or could if an adversary had action to them or had access to them, and using that same engineering sensibility to think about controls that might limit, even if the adversary got access, what they could do. We are not advocating getting rid of traditional cybersecurity. Instead, we want to complement digital protections with physical protections, things that making sure that an adversary, even if they got full control, had limits on what they could do. And I'm sure that we'll go into more detail as our conversation starts.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Demos and Ginger. I've now got some questions that we'll have a dialogue now with each of the panelists. And in many cases, this may stimulate those of you watching us or attending with questions that you have of your own. And again, you can, when we get to the question and answer session, you can unmute and ask those, or you can put those in the chat at any time. So let me start with question for Matt. Matt, with what you talked about, why bother with secure communications? Why not put a firewall or gateway in front of the legacy equipment and just call it a day?
Well, I think that sometimes that gateway is the good way to go, but you end up making what I like to call a bubble out of your OT network. It's a nice bubble, it's really pretty, but then once anything gets in, it pops. And so the question is, to Ginger's point earlier, how do you make sure that even if something does go wrong, even if a threat actor comes through, we get some novel vulnerability, that the amount of damage that can be caused is fairly limited. So secure communication gives you more gates and guards is a way to think about it. So like who gets to talk to who, what are they allowed to talk about, and has that communication been messed with? I mean, there's real engineering value to that as well, right? Like how do you even know like what your processes are doing? There's a lot of functional verification to this that just like limits bad misconfigurations from having an impact, much less a malicious actor. Like, an example I like to use is take like cellular SCADA or grid balancing communication going over telco networks, right? Without secure communication, I mean, the government has widely reported that threat actors like Salt Typhoon have compromised core telecommunications equipment. Do you know if like your SCADA communication has been manipulated? I mean, secure communication basically eliminates the guesswork from some of those problems. You just know whether or not something is trustworthy, and from there, it just kind of simplifies the rest of your security ecosystem. I'm a former like IDS continuous monitoring kind of guy. And let me tell you, if you start from the foundation of I know that this device is really this device, and I know it sent this message, it's so much simpler. Yeah, somebody could have hacked that device, but now we're not trying to work from the ground up and kind of rebuild our sense of trust from nothing. We at least have somewhere to start. And so that's the real benefit. But a gateway is usually a good solution, particularly for legacy base install bases to start.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Matt. And we had a question related to this in the chat a little earlier too. Demos, you can't protect what you can't see. How do you create an accurate OT asset inventory for legacy systems without disrupting operations?
Yes, as I mentioned before, the best way to tackle the problem is to do a risk assessment. The first item on your risk assessment is to make an inventory of all of your equipment. However, it is very rare that the utility will have a complete inventory. And the tools that they exist, that they can be used for IT type security, like Nmap, for example, or other scanning tools, it's likely that they will crash your OT environment. So because of that, we need to use scanning tools that they were designed specifically for OT environment, things that they are non-intrusive. And that will help us get the majority of the hardware that exists on the network, even if we cannot determine what the device is by just scanning. At least we can have a good idea of what the device does. We can also monitor the communication between the different devices, and that will also give us some hints as to what's going on the network and where these devices are.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Demos. Ginger, wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned engineering controls. What are they, and how do they differ from traditional cybersecurity controls, such as network segmentation or identity and access management?
That's a great question. Trust the labs to come up with jargon that means something to us, but may not make sense to everyone. So I've got a picture. If we can go to, I think, slide 22 in our deck, my colleague Benjamin Lampe did some research into what are good engineered controls. And so the idea behind an engineered control is that this is something, it may be analog or it may have digital components, but ideally it is out of the same controllable band as my software and digital technology. And I can use it either to limit what is possible to happen via digital technology, or I can use it to monitor and ensure that the digital signals that I'm getting in the data is valid. If indeed the tank or the pressure is turned up to 500, let me validate that with an additional sensor that may have been either a different pathway for an adversary to get to, or that is out of band from my digital technology altogether. And again, if we can get to that slide, at least it's not showing on my, there we go, back one. Okay, so Ben has come up with even some categories of engineered controls. And if you look at these, some of these will seem very quaint. What do you mean? It is 2026. We are the digital generation, but yet you're showing me controls that are bimetallic and all of these things. The idea behind engineered controls is we may be able to find something, maybe it's a time delay relay or a pressure relief valve, that even if an adversary had unconstrained access, this will limit what it is possible for them to do. It's not perfect security because this is your last ditch option before an impact or an unconstrained impact happens. But it is a great way to say, now that I've constrained the worst that can happen, and I'm using good cybersecurity techniques to constrain the remainder of the bad things that can happen, I might actually be able to invest in more digitization instead of less. So my colleague Ben, again, has created a database of more than 62,000 of these. And for those that would like to explore it, I'll put a link into the chat. But this category gives you an idea of the kinds of things that would be within the boundaries of engineered controls. And the last thing I'll say on this is if we characterize risk as the probability times the impact, an engineered control lets us control the impact that could be had, where traditional cybersecurity controls, like all the ones that have been mentioned, segmentation, access management, continuous monitoring, those dial down the probability that an adversary could make the effect occur. So ideally, we want to lower risk in both of its contributing variables and not in just one.
Great. Thanks, Ginger. Matt, I want to ask you another question regarding integrity. And, Ginger may want to add to this. Can you talk about functional integrity versus informational integrity? These ideas work well in concert.
Yeah, so I'll start with informational and then I'll hand it over to Ginger. So the informational integrity side protects the ones and zeros as they go over the wire, but it doesn't really understand what the ones and zeros do. So, but without that understanding, you really don't have protections against somebody telling, if somebody tells the system to do something that's just kind of stupid, you don't have a protection against that, but you know that the stupid command verifiably went from A to B. Now, functional integrity is where all of Ginger's work comes in, which is really protecting, should this really be happening? Ginger, do you want to expand on that at all?
That's completely right. Functional integrity is what the data inside the packet means. And if we applied that data to our system, what would happen? And in an ideal sense, our engineers would help us understand if I've got a packet that contains a lot of different control information, maybe many of those values, even if an adversary got to it and changed what they were, it wouldn't really make a difference in the system. But in some cases, there are key data elements that if an adversary manipulated them, that would go through undetected and within a system of trust, and that could cause that undesired consequence. So our recommendation would be, using that engineering insight, we can actually prioritize our monitoring, focusing our SOC and other attention on those data values instead of just watching all the traffic go by as if all of it is the same.
Thank you both. Demos, regarding the upgrade problem.
Yeah, we have a lot of legacy devices that they cannot be upgraded. Ideally, to Matthew's point, we want to be able for the device to authenticate from end to end to the other entity that is attempt to communicate to this device. However, that's not always going to be the case. In cases like that, we can implement some other protection mechanisms. For example, use a firewall or a gateway that is OT aware, and that will not only know about the protocol, but it can do like a deep packet inspection, so it can actually look at the payload of the protocol, and it can use some analytics to determine whether or not the traffic that is being received and is sent to the device, it makes sense. It's just to use an extreme example, if we have a sensor that for the last week was reporting 5 amps, and now all of a sudden is reporting 20. It's an indication that there is something wrong there. Either somebody manipulate the values coming from the device, or even worse, there is a failure in the device itself. So it's yes, it's good to put a lot of emphasis on the network part of of our infrastructure, but we should also look at the physical sensor, the actual data that is coming from the device, and this is one way to help the legacy problem.
Okay, thank you, Demos. Another question, Ginger. You talked about CIE. It's really a very different way of thinking about applying controls and protections for ICS and operational technology. So I would think some of the folks are thinking, if you haven't done it, CIE, what's the best way for an organization to start their CIE journey?
So I'm going to ask for another slide. I think I tucked one in. Thank you. The most important thing, the single first best thing an organization can do to just start thinking about cyber-informed engineering, even if the journey goes no further, is to bring the engineering expertise that understands what is the process, what is that functional integrity that needs to stay in place, the physics, the engineering, someone like Deimos maybe, into the conversation. Where the protections for digital technology are being discussed. They can help those cyber folks understand what's really happening in this process. What's the most important thing? What are the business consequences of an attack or something going wrong? If you look at cyber-informed engineering, and thank you, Matt, for putting the implementation guide in the chat, don't get overwhelmed. There are 12 principles. There are a number of things that we want to raise to people's thinking, but the single two most controls to think about or areas to think about are first, consequence-focused design. How do I identify if someone had access to my digital technology? What's the worst impact that they could affect? And then in the second principle, how can I create engineered controls that would stop that impact from happening? Even if that's all that happens out of a CIE journey, just those discussions will work to make a process far more robust and far more predictable. And it will mean that the cyber folks will get out of the functional checklist of what should happen, and they will start to understand physically what is really happening in the physical domain and how does the digital domain align with it. Then I would say ensure that cyber leaders have a pipeline so that they can talk to engineers. Even if it's someone on the SOC who says, I'm getting weird network traffic, is there someone in operations that they're allowed to call, that they talk with on a regular basis so that they can say, hey, are there process implications of what I'm seeing? And encourage them to work together. One of our collaborative partners talks about having asset owners take a day without automation exercise. So what would happen, not if my automation just failed, but if it all was untrustworthy? Could I operate in that environment? Okay, if I had to then pay $10,000 to turn automation back on, what are my most important areas of automation that I would eagerly pay to have this work correctly? Because that will help me back into where my protections ought to be. Cyber-informed engineering is taking some of these ideas, and we're publishing an adoption pathways document that can help folks trying to adopt CIE look at how some other organizations have done it. And we are releasing a capability maturity model. So if there's an organization that would like to measure and assess how well they're doing this and maybe plan the next paths on their journey, those tools could help that implementation journey start. And the labs are always available for questions. So I'll put an email address in the chat, but if you are starting your CIE journey and you'd like a little help, we would love to help you.
Thank you, Ginger.
Virginia, I'm a little curious.
Oh, go ahead, Grant.
Hi, Virginia. This is Grant Gilchrist. If I understand correctly, the item that you had up there is 2. Could involve a lot of logic and things that are not usually considered to be part of a cybersecurity solution, right? So substation automation, for instance, has had this concept of interlocking for a long time, where you make it actually impossible, even if it's an authorized operator, you make it impossible for them to close a switch into ground, right? So you can't get arcing, no matter, even if you are under attack, it's not going to happen, right? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Is putting in those kinds of rules on top of all the cyber solutions that you've got?
That's a great cyber-informed engineering control. So we would call that an engineering or an engineered control, because it prevents, even if I have, gone to virtual protective relays, which is something that, deep breath, a lot of people are thinking about. I have a physical protection that ensures that a bad thing can't be made to happen. The wonderful thing about engineered controls is there is often a chance for me to take credit for those in my safety practices and in my cyber practices. So they serve two functions. And again, the other thing that this helps with, even though this may seem like I'm getting in the DeLorean and I'm going back in time, with these in place, I can then say, well, maybe the risks of having limited autonomy in this environment, maybe the risks of more digitization in this environment, I can lower those because I've engineered out that worst case. And now all I have to deal with is the bad case, but not the worst one. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, and to add to that, because CISA as well, we've been doing a lot as far as like crisis preparation, particularly with everything going on geopolitically. And as a big piece of that, it gets down to kind of what Ginger is saying, right? It's like, how do you make the floor, like how far down you can go, like an acceptable tolerance for you, be that a day without automation or even just a day without SCADA, right? Like we've been hitting somewhere in the middle. We're kind of in the communications outage in addition to day without SCADA is kind of where CISA's landing it, but to varying degrees, right? And so it's really about how can we prevent that very worst day? Because I mean, to give another example, right? Like there was a talk at a big conference just I think 2 years ago now, or just over a year ago, about how smart ovens are replacing their like hardware interlock that prevented the oven from getting so hot it burned the surrounding wood, and they made that a software check instead. Like, well, you could conceivably now have a vulnerability that allows you to set things on fire with the oven. And so the CIE approach would, of course, during the design phase, from the more CIE, secure by design kind of intersection, say, please don't do that. Maybe that's not worth the risk, right? Not to say go to the past, don't digitally do digital automation, but there's some foundational levels of it that are just good to have so that you can only end up in such a bad state. So as things get more and more connected, we like to say all the time that air gap isn't real because things are getting more and more connected in OT environments. And I think that's true. But this isn't to say, be a Luddite and go to the past. This is to say, as you're getting more connected, the only responsible way to be is to have emergency planning in place so that on your bad day, it can only get so bad and you can keep providing services. Because otherwise you're just ramping up the risk without a real fallback plan. And so I think, CIE is an excellent example of a fallback plan.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ginger, Matt. Thanks, Grant, for adding to the conversation. Ginger talked about starting a CIE journey. Matt, from your perspective, from your perspective, what would you say in terms of where do we start? Where do we start?
So, one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is because when we talk about where do we start, or we talk about interviews with operators and why people have not adopted secure communications, you found a lot of people who are waiting for that rip and replace timeline. They found where they're doing the big CapEx cycle, they're going to change out a bunch of equipment, and then finally they'll be secure. And then they get to that point and they've done 5 years of planning, and actually they're a little unsure if the new solution that they got will be sustainable. And then here we are, right? It's how we end up with greenfield systems that still aren't using a lot of these technologies. And so what I would encourage is, throw out a lot of those IT best practices for certificate lifespans. Don't try to apply this across your entire organization. Just start zone by zone, bit by bit, functional unit by functional unit, substation by substation if you must, right? Like start with non-expiring certificates and configure devices to just initially log things that would be in doubt. So hey, here's an area where something would have been dropped. You can check it out. Hopefully it's not a million logs, but if it's a million logs, better that you did that with just logs rather than actually dropping traffic. You can then, over time, you're going to get comfortable with those steady state operations. You're not going to see very many logs. And then maybe you can start actually dropping traffic that wouldn't have passed that check before. And then over time, you practice automated key rotation. You're not as worried about certificates expiring. And over time, you can increase your comfort level so that all of these operations are just part of your normal day to day, but you at the same time haven't required your operators to become cybersecurity experts, right? I think the path out of this is not all of us becoming cyber wizards. The path is how do we make a sustainable solution with our existing operator base? And I think, we're getting there. There's a lot of solutions and technology that is making it easier to do a lot of this management from the operator side, that is abstracting away the complexity of things like key management, or just not doing PKI, right? Like doing things like pre-shared certificates. But there's And I think as you can adopt more of the solutions, you'll be better off. But in the meantime, take it slow, take it step by step. Don't try to do everything all at once, because that's a good way to break things. And I think, as we've seen from many organizations, um, there's a real freezing effect on the industry. If anything breaks, we would run into scenarios like, hey, I turned on the secure version of OPC. Oh, by the way, it didn't work between vendors. It wasn't actually interoperable because they didn't turn on the security features when doing interoperability testing. They fixed this since. But like then the operator we were interviewing was like, yeah, and I told everybody that OPC didn't work for security. And I was like, great, no, that's not what happened. One of your vendors failed the interoperability check, but this is kind of how things work, right? Like if it causes an operational impact and there's any risk, you're not going to use it, your peers aren't going to use it. And so we're really risk adverse. And so use an adoption strategy that allows you to get the benefits while still being risk adverse. Maybe good to transition to the. Oh no, sorry, Ginger answered the question in the chat. Never mind. There was just a good follow-up from the previous discussion.
Thanks, Matt. Demos, you talked about legacy systems in the last question I asked, and everyone has legacy systems that can't be upgraded. How can we isolate the legacy systems from IT networks to prevent propagation of malware? How can we do that?
Yeah. One of the simplest techniques that we can use is to use network segmentation. We need to isolate the IT system from the OT system by the use of DMZ. It's like the Purdue model has been around, I don't know, since 2007 or something, and that's a good guide. So provide a buffer between the OT system and the IT environment. So if something occurs in the in the IT environment, you are able to unplug your OT systems from the IT until the issue has been resolved. I mean, I have been looking at events that they happen over the past 12 months that affected OT systems, and most of them, maybe all of them, it was attacks like ransomware attacks in the IT environment. So if I have a mechanism where I can unplug from the IT environment until my system is secure, then I will be able to continue operating. And to Matthew's point, it's not a matter of if, it's a when, and we need to have processes and procedures in place to continue operating even while the environment is under attack. We need to put some thought into resilience and recovery and how do we go about doing that, as opposed to the idea that we're going to prevent every possible attack, because that's just not going to happen. In addition to that, even within the OT environment, we can use microsegmentation. There are devices that they need to talk to each other, but they don't necessarily need to talk to every device or your network. So the standards have these notions of zones. We can have different zones of security and apply different mechanisms to protect the devices in the individual zones.
Okay, thanks, Demos. Okay, in a few minutes we'll open it up to any one of you that wants to unmute. You can ask questions and we can answer them in the chat. Some of these responses might be better in an open discussion, more live instead of written. So if you want, like Ginger just said in the chat. So let's take advantage of the opportunity to discuss any questions you have with the panelists. But I wanted to, Ginger, the responsibilities of the asset owner and the vendor in a situation. CIE seems to put a lot of responsibility for security on the asset owner. but where does the vendor fit in with this?
So I'll see a piece of this, but Matt, I'm hoping you can join in. You have spent a lot of time in this particular trench. So cyber-informed engineering does not suggest that the vendor doesn't have a responsibility for security. Instead, we acknowledge that even with securely developed products using all of the right techniques for development and all of the right methods, there are still chances, and we're hearing about a lot more with Mythos. Okay, I'll drop that. That vulnerabilities, even long-standing vulnerabilities. I have a friend that was faced with a 27-year-old vulnerability recently. That these can exist in these well-developed products. So as an asset owner, that's the entity that experiences the impact of a cyber attack. They have to do the cleanup in terms of their user base and any impacts to safety, reliability, and performance, any regulatory concerns that happen. And because they own the physical space where the process that this technology is supporting occurs, they have the opportunity to provide a great many more controls than a vendor might have. If I own the entire physical domain of the delivery of the service, I now live in an environment that the adversary can't touch unless they're standing in that physical environment with me. So I want to use that asset owner advantage and put in those controls in that location where we can. Now, this doesn't release the vendor of the responsibility to make well-developed products, and I'll let Matt speak to what that means. But what we're finding is where vendors can apply engineered controls within their products in addition to digital controls, and I put a teaser in the chat of a NASDAQ video about a vendor that's doing just that, then they add security that limits impacts that can affect the customer as well as making it harder for the adversary. So in an ideal situation, both the vendor and the asset owner are putting in both digital and engineered controls. Okay, over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Ginger. So CISA has a program called Secure by Design, which is trying to answer this question of how do we actually make it so that the people producing the software, the people producing things like these embedded systems that we all use, are taking more ownership of of their customers' relationship with cybersecurity. So rather than, I think default passwords is a great example of this. It's not that an operator can't change a default password if they buy a couple hundred units, right? The question is really, do we let the operator get in an environment where they could possibly make the mistake and forget to change 1 out of 100 default passwords? Or do we just make it so those bad choices are taken away from them so that the secure behavior is kind of the only behavior? Now, we often talk about this in like a kind of early 2000s cybersecurity sense of like, I'm just going to make your life really difficult, and that's what security means. Security doesn't have to be that way, right? Like usability is very possible to the point of this paper, right? The barriers to secure OT communication. The root of this was basically saying, hey, we're talking about secure by design perspective. We want people to use secure communications, but the technology has existed. Telling the OEMs to support secure communications better isn't really going to be beneficial if there isn't a growing install base of operators willing to use it. But there's a clear reason that operators aren't willing to use it. So how can CISA kind of close the gap between, well, we built the technology, that's good enough, and no, the technology has to be usable by operators. Otherwise, we're in a kind of in a world of hurt from an adoption perspective. So secure by design, includes things like kind of just like baseline expectations, things that make it easy to support a security ecosystem. If you don't have identity and access management, if you don't have logging, it's really difficult to actually support a baseline of cybersecurity because you don't know what's going on. You don't really know if there is an issue. So that might be authentication. That might be making sure that the only user account available isn't just admin with a default password that's only 8 characters, right? Depending on what level of POC you're at, that might be the only choice. So there's that end of it. And then the other half is much more the usability side of things. So my example for this is always patching. We often say that people don't patch in OT environments. It's not necessarily because patching, when you have to patch in downtime windows and so on. But it's not as simple as just saying, well, patching causes downtime, because there's plenty of technical solutions to limit the amount of downtime from a patch. In fact, like the entire IT industry of microservices is built around the idea of minimizing downtime from a patch. And so like it's not like the technology doesn't exist in theory, it's just not really being implemented in practice. So like pushing for the ecosystem change that would allow you to actually do things like patch vulnerabilities as they come out or limit the downtime or even just have more confidence that a patch won't break your system. These are all kind of comprehensive of things that we're pushing OEMs for as we're talking about secure by design and we're thinking about the role of the vendor. And finally, I'll give one last plug, which is the CIE adjacent version of this, which is thinking about, as we move more in the OT space towards things like, we have a long history of things like safety instrumented systems. So embedding safety in in a separate component that is sort of forcing safety upon the system. As we increase the levels of digital automation and we have more compute capability in our devices, it's worth thinking about what level of safety we actually just want to have embedded in individual components. So my favorite example is if I'm driving a truck 60 miles per hour down the highway right now, and basically all modern trucks, if I am an attacker and I say, hey, I'm connecting a second engine into that truck, the initial engine will say, oh, well, that's a little strange, but cool. I'm going to disconnect and new engine, you can take over. At which point your car will come to a very sudden and very painful stop. Sorry for the transportation analogy in a DNP workshop, but that's my background. And so, what we're really saying there is, at some point in the engine's decision-making process, the designer could have put something in to say, if I'm going 60 miles per hour down the highway, I am in a state similar to like what we think about with like run mode or with interlocks. I am in a state where clearly this should not be happening. And so I'll raise a diagnostic alert, but like I am not going to change my behavior. This needs to be addressed by a real human. And that sort of design philosophy right now is about basically like the cleverness of individual engineers at an OEM and at the vendor. And how do we think about that scaling as sort of like the long-term vision of how do we combine things like secure by design and CIE? How do we embed safety in components, use all of that intelligence for not just engineering goodness, but also safety and security goodness? We did release a paper on this, about a year ago now, but it's still relevant. It goes through at a high level, kind of like what we're asking OEMs for. And as you're thinking about procurement as an operator, the kind of security features you should be asking for as you talk to your OEMs. Notably, this includes co-seal with the European Commission. So a lot of these features are all required in Europe as of next year. So if you're an American company and their products are sold in Europe, great time to hold them over the fire to get those features for yourself. Sorry, that was a long tangent, but anyway. Sorry, John.
Thanks, Matt. And the link you put in the chat, right, to the paper?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. I've got a few more questions, but I'd like to open it up to any of you attending. Like we said, in addition to the chat, we welcome you to unmute. Have a little bit more flexibility in discussing questions and getting responses from the panelists. Maybe you can get a little bit more detail than we could with just the chat. So does anyone have any, can unmute, does anyone have any questions of the panelists?
Okay, I guess I'll get the ball rolling here. This is Richard Holmes, a consultant. I previously worked for Trimark to develop their gateway module. Virginia, can you give us some examples of where CIE was actually applied in an industrial setting, ideally in a power plant or a water plant?
Sure. So I've got two for you, and one I put a link in the chat because I loved this question, and that link is to an executive from the Fluence battery energy storage company talking about how they're using cyber-informed engineering. Essentially, they're looking at places where there is the possibility of digital signals causing, or if an adversary was able to get through, again, all of the very robust and good security that they admittedly have, if there was a chance for an adversary to get into the message queue and cause something within their battery technology to overheat, particularly to put it at risk of a fire. And that's their worst consequence situation, because that could involve danger to the population, certainly danger to property, and absolutely operational interruptions. And in this case, they're looking where they can put analog sensing and other controls in place that mean that they're not just depending upon the digital technology to do things correctly. And their goal with doing this is to future-proof that battery energy storage system, so that if you're buying it now, I can't even imagine what the threat looks like 20 years from now. Hopefully, secure by design, secure by demand, CIE, it'll be successful and there won't be those threats. But I don't live in that Tinkerbell universe, and I'm pretty sure you don't either. So the idea for this company is using CIE as a way of future-proofing the technology, so that what they can in terms of consequence is engineered out, and then they can add in appreciable, better digital controls as those are developed. So it's a great way of doing, I think, what Matt and Demos both talked about, of making the product better as technology allows, but using cyber-informed engineering, because I can predict those worst consequences today. Those aren't going to change. So if I can engineer those worst consequences out, now I can improve the security as I go along. The other example, and if you've ever heard a cyber-informed engineering overview, you've heard this one. It's a little overused, but it's a great example, and it's from the water sector. So this is a municipal water entity that has a series of water booster pump stations. And they maintain those right now manually, but they'd really like to go to cloud control so that their engineers can do other tasking and they can be more cost effective for their customers. So they evaluate a cloud solution that passes all of their cyber wickets, but they talk to the engineers and say, okay, is there anything that we should do that from an engineering standpoint to bolster those protections? The engineers do a CIE evaluation, and they determine that the worst case scenario, if an adversary got into this, is that they could access the pumps and turn them on and off and on and off and on and off, building up heat within the pump that eventually would damage the insulation and cause the pump itself to malfunction. And so to control that, they decide to put a time delay relay in line with each of the pumps. It costs them $20 to implement, and the engineers know how to do that on a regular outage. They don't have to do any, long contracting or significant equipment change. But what that does is maybe it constrains their pump control so that they can only manipulate the pump once every 30 minutes, but it limits the potential that an adversary causes that inrush current generated heat buildup that would actually break the pump equipment. And we use that example. It was developed from a real municipal water utility and a set of engineers that went through a CIE process with them. So again, $20 control, a very straightforward engineering idea, something that you would use for safety purposes anyway, but reapplied in this instance to allow the utility to use cloud technology.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Sounds like good engineering coupled with just a little bit of awareness of possibilities for cyber attack.
Right.
Absolutely. All the things we started doing and may have left behind in the excitement of digitization.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Ginger.
I'll speak for everybody advisedly and say, I think we'd particularly like to hear questions from individuals who find difficulty in usable security. Where are you getting all of the security advice in the world? And it just looks like it's not applicable to your situation. We are not the complaints department, but we know where they live.
Ginger, this is James. I might put you on the spot. You answered Hannah's question about the relationship between CIE and SP 800-160. And you talked about, acknowledging engineered controls as a valid family of controls to address digital risk. Could you just expand on that a little bit? That topic sounded interesting. I'm not super familiar. And so I just wanted to maybe hear a little bit more about it.
Sure. Right now, one of the largest challenges that the idea of using engineering to forestall an impact faces is that, and Matt, I'm really sorry, even in that paper that was released today, there is no acknowledgement that I can engineer out an impact, and that is a valid way to protect my systems. Instead, we get very focused on all of the digital technology, network segmentation, using, authentication, all of those tools, and we omit the idea that it is possible to engineer out an impact or control what digital technology can affect on physical systems. So, and where it is acknowledged, it's often treated as a compensating control, which typically in a mature security approach is a less than ideal way to go about it. So if I put a security control in that is an appropriate standards-driven control, that checks a box for me. If I do something odd, and Deimos can talk about this, and it's a compensating control, the people who oversee my program kind of say, well, you're not doing the right thing, but maybe if you just do it right. So what we'd like to do is make engineered controls appropriate controls that are credited as part of a security program from the ground up. And again, because we think about cyber designed by cyber people, we often forget about that engineering domain. So what we'd like to do is have NIST acknowledge that engineered controls can reduce cyber impacts, and that is a very valuable and appropriate way to reduce cyber risk.
Awesome. Thank you.
Anyone have question? I have one more for Deimos. Deimos, we've always we know that remote access to OT type equipment is needed, but of course the question is, how do we protect that, right?
Yeah,
how do we allow third-party vendors to service the legacy equipment, particularly the legacy equipment, but without introducing risk?
That's a very interesting topic, because for the longest time we had like the castle and moat approach. So we give people VPN access, and once they are in our network, we gave them complete trust. And from that point on, they can go anywhere they like within our network. I know DHS and other entities are starting to promote zero trust network architecture, and how do we go about that, applying it to the OT system, and that requires a little bit change of the way we're thinking. I mean, zero trust network, it is mature in the IT environment. However, for OT devices, there is some inherent trust between devices. So, for example, if I have a trip signal traversing through my network, I don't necessarily want to delay that signal by validating the authentication of that system. I mean, the other thing is, I, as a vendor or as a consultant, I shouldn't be allowed to access every system on your network. So by implementing zero trust network architecture, and I believe the new version of DNP, Secure DNP, or the proper name of it is, it has implemented some zero trust, and it's all about authenticating not just the individual, but go a level deeper and authenticate the actual device. Is this device actually allowed to talk to this other device on my network, or even down to the application level? Is this application allowed to reach this device on my network? I know this is not something that we think often, but I have seen instances in the past where somebody manipulate the HVAC system, which caused a catastrophic failure. Because if you lose control of your HVAC, of your control center, or of your data center, then things are going to overheat and they're going to start shutting down. So at least I would like for us to start thinking of how do we move from the standard VPN approach that allows us complete access to the network. And that could be because most people because it's easy, they use flat networks. And how do we protect that access? How can we limit that access? And that has to go beyond username and password and in an MFA. I mean, adversaries can bypass those protections. So there needs to be we need to have defense in depth and have additional protections to prevent that from happening.
And I just add on there, Demos, one of the things you mentioned around latency of like authenticating the traffic, if it's sensitive for something like remote access, or just like sending a some sort of safety control signal back out, right? Like we hear this all the time for reason why people don't want to adopt secure communication is because they're worried about latency over the network. And sometimes that's true, right? Like they have a really old cable that really can't support the bandwidth of any additional traffic. But oftentimes from testing, we've seen that the real bottleneck is really the application, right? Like the end controller is very slow at actually doing the authentication. And so I would just disambiguate between those two a little bit, because it might be that your authentication doesn't work because your network is old and you've got to like really do some real CapEx replacement, like over the medium of what wire you're using. But then the other half of this is the actual end controller. And sometimes that just comes to, not to circle everything back to secure by design, but like this literally just comes back to oftentimes the security functionality isn't as tested and isn't as built into the component. So it's not like it couldn't be faster. It's just that it wasn't a priority in the product development. So like it's possible that this is like an application delay. And if you communicate to the vendor that this is a use case that you care about, that this is something that's, I mean, purely updatable in software, and this was just not poorly optimized code, frankly. So it is possible to get some of this working to that microsecond or at least millisecond level. It's difficult, authenticated, but it's possible. Full encryption, a little more expensive, maybe more difficult, but I think it's possible as long as the vendors treat it as a priority feature.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you because most of the
Oh, for
vendors
sure.
prioritize protection over security. So maybe it's time that we change this thinking a little bit and start thinking more about security. And as you mentioned, having devices that they're secure by design as opposed to something that the security was an afterthought, it will help. Yeah.
Yeah, I have some colleagues who have published papers back in like 2010 on getting secure goose into millisecond timeframes. So it's possible. I won't link the paper. I won't have everybody's eyes bleed, but it's it's something that's workable, at least in academic circles, and people have implemented it sometimes, but it's just not widely there.
Right.
All right.
Okay,
I
I
do
got,
have,
I
you
got
have a
one more
question,
question.
Richard?
If you got a few minutes.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Since this is the DNP users group, can I ask what are DNP's plans to help with these problems? And so SA5 was pretty much a flop in the marketplace. Is something better coming in the future?
I'm hoping we can get Grant or maybe Andrew if they're
Sure.
available to address that.
Sure. Yes. SAV6, which is now being renamed DNP3 SL for security layer, is coming, and the version of the IEEE 1815 document that is currently being reviewed. I think the plan is to get it out later this year. At least I hope so anyway, or at least get the next set of next set of ballots finished on it. And so the attempt to make it more palatable, I guess, than a lot of vendors found with SAV5 was it's much simpler. It's a separate layer that rather than trying to work it into the guts of the DNP application layer. Using elliptic curve algorithms, which are a lot lower in performance requirements than anything SAV5 was using. And eventually this will be paired with what we're calling the Authorization Management Protocol, or AMP. And what AMP is intended to do is to do for PKI what the DNP security layer does, which is to be able to do authorization management, certificate management, that sort of thing, over a mixed TCP/IP and serial network, which is not possible right now with the technologies that are out there because they stop dead wherever the internet protocols stop. So that's a very, very short answer. I can do half an hour on it, or I can do 2 hours on it, or 4 hours on it if you'd like. But that's the short answer on it.
Okay, thanks for the update.
Okay. Thanks, Richard, for the question. Thanks, Grant. Let me say, based on Richard's first question, Ginger, you talked about 2 use cases. Matt, you talked about you've talked about indicators of usability. With use case, from your perspective, what are indicators of usability? This will be our last question.
Yeah, as part of this paper, as we were going through, it became kind of apparent that operators just needed something to look for, because it's hard to really tell before you buy a product if it's actually going to be usable, easy to maintain. And so some of the things that we saw from like the procurement angle was, are there documented upgrade paths for going from like the existing legacy protocol to the newer kit? Like, is that an expected use case and something that they have designed around? Is there stuff like secure discovery and provisioning to help quickly onboard new components, or do you have to, manually have a spreadsheet and tag that into the system in order to do the initial deployment? Right, like that initial deployment step and the planning for like how is a operator reasonably going to do it? Have they attempted to help you out in any way as part of that process? And finally, like secure workflows. So like, what is the process for you to actually update any of the keys? How are you communicating about like what the product is meant to do? And so making sure that you can have at least some conversation with the vendor to understand, kind of what are some marks of success, or some, at least good kind of rules of thumb for communicating with them. So at the bottom of the paper, there is a summary of recommendations, both for the operator side to, we saw a bunch of pitfalls, we saw a bunch of places where people got stuck, as well as recommendations for the OEM side, for the vendor side. So I'd encourage people to check that out for a more comprehensive list than what I can remember off the top of my head for what that looks like.
So I want to wrap up here. Thanks from my perspective. Then I'll turn it over to James. But can't thank you guys enough, Matt, Ginger, Demos. It's been rich in content. I hope, like I hope all the attendees, it's a good use of time. Very, very rich in content. Learned a lot, and I really like the different perspectives of the panelists on the same topics. Also, I want to emphasize, this is our 4th workshop, and Hannah, thanks for your comment in the chat about thanking the user group for making workshops open to non-members and former members. That's we really encourage, this is open to the public, and it's a great opportunity to learn from experts in the industry, and for them to answer your questions, and also I think hear questions of others and hear their responses to other questions. So again, thanks to the 3 panelists, and thanks for all of you that attended. And I'll turn it over, James, to you. Okay, thanks everybody.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, this was an excellent session. I really liked this format. I enjoyed getting to hear a little bit more dialogue this time around, and that was good. We may have to consider doing more of this, or maybe mixing it up as we go forward. John, thanks to you for your moderation again today. Appreciate what you bring to the session, and kind of pulling some more information out of our panelists. Just want to again remind everyone, anything that you need information wise that you can't get or you can't find your way to on the website, Sarah is at the ready, our membership coordinator at membership@dnp.org. So if you're a utility and you haven't signed up to be in that utility council that's coming up in May, feel free to reach out and get some more information on that. Again, be on the lookout to our members for that upcoming training announcement for part 2 on our 1815.2 DNP profile training. That'll be announced hopefully here in the next couple of weeks. We'll nail down that date. But anything else that you want to see, if you've got topics that you think are of interest to the industry, or if you're a member that would like to see some more in-depth training on a particular topic related to DNP 3 or any of the other work products of the users group, feel free to let us know. Again, Sarah's email is the best place to get us that information at membership@dnp.org. So with that, I'll say again, thank you very much to everyone. Really appreciate everyone joining us today. It's a great session, and we look forward to having the recording available for you in the coming weeks. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.